Okay, welcome. Welcome to Peace Week at George Mason University's Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution. This is a session of the Carter School's Peace Week. There are other events you can find on our website. And this is also part of the 50th anniversary of George Mason University's founding that we're celebrating this week. And I'm Susan Allen. I'm an associate professor here at the Carter School at George Mason. And I am very pleased today to introduce Dr. Paula Garb, who is a dear friend and mentor and expert in this region that I'll be discussing and the processes I'll be discussing, and has agreed to serve as our moderator and to interview me a bit about this book. So I'm excited for the conversation. So Dr. Paula Gar is a former co-director of the Center for Citizen Peacebuilding at the University of California at Irvine. She's now a senior fellow at the Center for Peacemaking Practice here at George Mason University. Since 1994, she's facilitated citizen dialogues and taught peaceful problem-solving skills in conflict zones in the South Caucasus and Middle East. Her work as a peace practitioner and researcher has led to multiple publications in books and journals, and to a commitment to promoting the mainstreaming of peace literacy, K-16 worldwide. For 25 years, she taught courses in mediation, conflict resolution, civic and community engagement at UC Irvine, and gang mediation and negotiation at UCI, and at California State University, Los Angeles. She directed several academic programs at UCI, including the Mediation Certificate Program, the minor in conflict resolution, the minor in civic and community engagement. And Dr. Garb has a PhD in anthropology from the Russian Academy of Sciences Institute of Anthropology. So thank you so much for joining us today, Paula, to help with discussing and a bit of celebration of my book's publication. Thank you. I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, it's great to see everybody, and it's this virtual world is wonderful. I see some old friends and people I've seen on webinars lately that I wouldn't have otherwise been able to hear. So I'm really glad to be with you, and this is an important conversation. I'm sure many of you have, all of you have important contributions to make, so I also invite you to help us have a conversation about how all of this experience that's in this book. If you haven't seen it, oh, my virtual, oh, there we go. And is downloadable for free. Has a lot in it that can be used, applied for the task ahead of us in getting out of this horrific situation and going forward with a real peace movement. So worldwide. May I ask that whoever is hosting, besides Susan, make sure that everybody's muted while we're talking, because I have seen a lot of people without mutes on. I still see on my screen a couple of, there we go, very good. All right, so Susan, I would like you to start off with a summary, short summary of your book for those who haven't had a chance to read it, so we can go forward with details.
Okay, I will do that. And if I could ask someone to post the open access link to the book in the chat. Someone's asked for that, and I was going to look it up, but I'll talk about the book first, and I can look it up later when you guys are talking amongst yourselves here. So thank you for this opportunity. I'm going to try briefly to present kind of key points from the book, and do encourage you all to download the free open access book because it's open access with the reason that we want people to read it. This is part of the Better Evidence Project at George Mason University. Has an initiative to make as much as possible open access. And this book predates that, but I'm excited about other things we're also making open access. So I'm on a kick for sharing knowledge in this field. So first thing, I'm just going to go chapter by chapter because I titled the chapters with kind of summary comments of what the main point of each chapter is. So chapter 1 is called "What Exists is Possible." And what I mean here is track 2 diplomacy, track 1.5 diplomacy, informal dialogues, they do exist. And even if someone tells you that's not possible, it is possible because they exist. People are doing this, and it may be invisible. So chapter 1 introduces this kind of invisible work that is behind the scenes, informal conversations amongst people in conflict areas, bridging across ceasefire divides, etc. So I tell some stories there of particularly one example being I was at a kind of reception with various diplomats here in DC, and someone said to me, "Oh, the South Caucasus, you're working with Georgians and South Ossetians. It's just not possible to do any peacemaking there." And I said, "Well, actually, we just had a meeting, last month, and we're doing this." And the person repeated, "It's just not possible." So that made me think I needed to title this chapter, "What Exists is Possible." So that's the overview intro chapter. And then I go through a chapter that describes the particular case study that comes up over and over in the book. And so the second chapter is Georgians and South Ossetians Wage War and Peace, and describe some of the history of the context there. And it's a lot more complex than we saw in our US headlines. So it's, some Americans would think, oh, that this is a conflict only between Georgians and Russians, and they don't even know South Ossetians exist. So that chapter puts forward that there are also South Ossetians that are part of this, and some of the complexity of the relationships, and some of the ways that people are working towards building peace there too. So then the third chapter, and this is more for my academic audiences, the third chapter presents that practice builds theory, that this is a valid way of learning about conflict resolution by doing conflict resolution. So I look at forms of evaluation, engaged scholarship, action research, reflective practice. And again, this is something very much related to other initiatives here at the Carter School. We're launching an initiative on evidence to action, bridging from the evidence of peacemaking work to action and peacemaking work, and vice versa. So kind of a virtuous cycle of we do peace work, we learn from it, that builds our evidence base, builds our understandings and insights, and then that informs the future peace work. So that's sort of a cycle. And so this book, the insights I'm presenting in the book are very much based in doing peace work, whether it's been in the Georgian South Ossetian context or other places. And I also am engaging with other practitioners and what they've shared with me that they've learned from their work. Okay, so those first three chapters kind of introduce everything. Then chapter 4 is called People Make Peace. And that may sound really simple, but I gotta say, there's all this focus, particularly when we academics look at peacemaking work, there can be all this focus on, analyzing the particular factors and the processes and the structures and the power dynamics and the, all sorts of different aspects of peacemaking, techniques that matter and so forth. In the end of it all, I just want to make the point, it's all about people. And if we forget that, if we get too wrapped up into different ideologies or different political stances, we forget about the people, and then we're forgetting an important part. The other part about People Make Peace is that individual agency matters too. So even though there are big geopolitical dynamics that constrain what individuals can do, there are also people who make a difference. They make a choice that changes something in their society that has rippling effects. Okay, then chapter 5 is The Process Shapes People-Centered Peacemaking. And here I look at different kinds of processes people have worked with. I'd have kind of a case study of Estonian-Russian relations, and work that was done in the 90s in Estonia with the Russian-speaking community in Estonia, and look at the processes of Georgian South Ossetian work that I've worked on, and looking at the different forms of interactive conflict resolution that really put people at the center rather than negotiating between states being at the center. Then 6th chapter is Locals Lead with Global Awareness. This chapter connects the idea of local leadership with locals also being very much aware of the geopolitical dynamics around them. So individuals living in Tskin Valley or in Tbilisi or Gori or any of these cities involved in the region there, they can make a difference locally. They can notice, oh, we need to work on sharing irrigation water across a certain irrigation channel. They've got this local problem that they need to work across the ceasefire line on. And they also see that that's embedded in the bigger geopolitical dynamics, Russian and Western tensions, et cetera. So looking at the way that they've been able to work on local issues, but also understand the local issues in a broader context. And then Chapter 7 looks at the way local peacemakers have adapted their work. And this is because the broader context has changed. The conflict changes. And so the work people are doing has changed. Looking particularly at the Georgian South Ossetian context, we see an initial post-war 2008 focus on humanitarian needs and people reaching out to help each other with, finding missing persons across the other side, checking on a grave that's across the other side, working on prisoner release, working on irrigation water, these humanitarian sorts of issues. And then turning to a phase of building some confidence and catalyzing other confidence building measures. And then turning to a phase of when there's more of a pressure on South Ossetians not to engage with Georgians and not to do confidence building measures, then there was a shift towards, well, we can do research together. Academics can connect across all sorts of divides across the world to do research. And so a shift towards shared analysis and collaborating to create multi-perspective understandings of the conflict dynamics there. So those are different adaptations of the process. Then finally, Chapter 8 is both individuals and groups of people make peace. And here I emphasize that networks can be a powerful way that people work together. I've said individual agency matters and lots of examples of individuals making a big difference, but then people working together makes a huge difference. So when people can bring their different strengths, their different social capital, their different connections to then create movement towards peace, that can be really powerful. And then finally, Chapter 9 presents a synthesis of lots of insights on peacemaking. A key one being, what kinds of peacemaking should you do? You should do the kind that's possible. Some pie in the sky idea that comes from some theory or from some other context, but doesn't work in the context you're working in, isn't going to work. So I have kind of a list there in Chapter 9 of characteristics of successful peace processes with an emphasis on the unofficial part. These are processes that are possible. They're safe enough for people to participate in. No one's going to get beaten up when they go home or thrown in jail for having participated. We came up with a kind of a metaphor for this work. We call it pushing the envelope without tearing it. So pushing the envelope meaning that we're kind of moving things along beyond the kind of boundaries of what we think is possible. We're expanding the space for engagement, but we're not doing it so much that we tear that piece of paper that is the envelope, or that we burst that balloon that is the space that we're expanding. Other characteristics are that these processes have strong leadership from people living in the conflict area. They are sensitive to the specific conflict context. They have to change over time because the conflict context is changing over time. They include reflective practice and participatory evaluation. They offer something new, not the same old, but bringing in something that's not covered at the official level or not covered in other processes. Transferring beyond the immediate process to having broader impact. Engaging both those who are most open to peacemaking and also those who are more skeptical. And covering essential costs. Yeah, I've run into people who are like, oh, peacemaking, cool, that sounds great, but it doesn't cost anything, right? And you got to get people across the ceasefire line. They need a flight ticket or a bus ticket or staying in a hotel. So there are those costs. And that ends up taking up a lot of the time of people doing peacemaking work is finding that. I also have a list of guidance for people who want to engage as peacemakers from outside a context, because that's the positionality I've had. in most of my work is working outside of my own community here in the US. Clarify the peacemaker positionality and impartiality. I've tried to clarify that, I am a US citizen, but I am not representing the US in any way, and I'm not carrying US policy. I'm simply looking for, do people want to talk? Is there a role for an academic to bring people together? I'm impartial, except that I really don't like war and I don't like the horrors of war. So I'm partial for a nonviolent approach if possible. Other advice: keep showing up, listen, conduct joint analysis, engage over the long term, build relationships, engage the strengths of multiple peacemakers, work with the platforms people bring to the process. Again, this is the emphasis on no one person can do all this. It's the interconnections between a lot of people that bring a lot of different strengths to bear. Let go of control. I think the most effective peacemaking discussions I've had are ones where I was kind of like, I have no idea how this could go. Is this even possible? And then let go of control and people make it work. Yeah, I think that's kind of the expanding the options of what's possible and not always working in the safe zone of where we know what to expect. Coordinate within multifaceted peace processes. I see some good friends here who've been parts of related processes in different parts of the world, and it's been great to have deep connections with others who are working for peace, each from our own different perspectives. And keep learning. That's my final piece from chapter 9, keep learning. So with that, I will stop talking and I will listen to some of your comments. So back to you, Paula. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. That was an amazing quick summary and very in-depth, and yet did not drag out. So thank you for that. And looking around, I just want to make sure that everybody has their mic muted. I don't hear any extra sounds, but just a reminder. Thank you, Ziad, for posting the link to Susan's book. And I hope all of you get a chance to read it. But right now, I'm going to turn to my questions and then later to yours. So first question, Susan, is I know you already told a short story from your book, but I think one of the great things about reading your book are the stories. So I'd like you to share one, please. And if possible, one that might help us, one about, yes, about how, the difficulties of working with people very soon after violence. You began coordinating the discussions within a few months after the 2008 war. Nothing compared to the war that we're watching now horrifically on television. But still, people were very traumatized and still in a state of shock. So if you can tell us a story about how you began or how you worked through that with people.
Yeah, I guess the story of the first invitations that you and I discussed, and I see Laura Olson's here. She was part of the early discussions there, just after the 2008 war in August. Several of us had connections and discussions with people on both sides of that ceasefire line in the time leading up to the war and then afterwards. How we got started. The simple answer is just by asking, is there anything worth talking about that you want to talk about across this divide? There's a little more to it, which I do share in the book, so I'll go ahead and share it here. We initially got a letter from a South Ossetian who said, look, your media is just full of misinformation about what really happened here. We want to come to the US and tell the truth about the war. And can you write us an invitation letter so we can apply for visas? And my response was, well, it's not kind of what I do. I don't really just put one side of the story out. And, the university does have some conference rooms, but you're just not going to get an audience to just tell one side of the story here. But if you wanted to come to the United States and meet with some Georgians in a 3-day retreat setting, a few of us here, and Paula was part of it, and Laura was part of it. I'm not seeing the other faces because this has gone on to more than 2 screens here. But so we had a group of us that invited some Georgian track 2 people and some Ossetian track 2 people, and they came to George Mason for a 3-day private, confidential opening discussion where the basic agenda item is there anything worth talking about across this divide so soon after the war. And that's where there were kind of 2 things that were worth talking about: the explanation of telling each other what they each had witnessed with their own eyes during the war, and making sense of what they'd seen and experienced, and some tears around the losses. And then the humanitarian need. And these are humanitarian needs that required people to work together across that ceasefire line. And so that was a very, that was a place where I didn't have any real idea of how productive the conversation would be, but yet people came with something they really did want to talk about, and did talk, and that led to a series of efforts that worked on humanitarian issues. Yeah, so that's one story. I could tell other stories too. We kept coming across things that just seemed so challenging. So there was a discussion of, could there ever be a release of a certain set of prisoners that for the South Ossetians were a very symbolic group, and that were had been convicted of a terrorist act in the Georgian court system. And a lot of different people came together to advise on what would be possible and what were the barriers. And so people looking at these barriers and saying, well, gee, if Georgian society sees these people as, convicted of this terrorist act, no one's going to want to dishonor the families of the victims by releasing these people. And so then someone said the idea of, well, what if we talk to the families of the victims and explain to them the significance of these prisoners in the broader scheme of things? And we ended up with some of the families of the victims speaking out publicly and saying, if their release can be useful for broader peace process, we support it. And this would be an honor for our fallen family members. And that sort of kind of problem solving with multiple different perspectives in the room together and thinking about what's possible took what seemed like an insurmountable challenge and found a way that, well, maybe this could help a bit. And it still took a lot of time, but eventually those prisoners were released, and that was a confidence building measure. And the families of the victims of, the people who had died in that terrorist act were supportive of that release. Yeah, so that's another story of kind of how do you get started around something that seems insurmountable, and bringing different people who each have different expertise and different insights into what's possible together was something that made that possible.
Thank you. Well, the next question is just a little more focused on Ukraine, Russia. And we all know how much more destructive this war is than, at least in my time, anything I've worked with. And Susan, have you any thoughts that come, from the reflection that you did in writing the book about how any of us, you and any of us, can begin now, or certainly in the future? All wars have to end, and some kind of ceasefire or some kind of peace settlement could allow for the beginning of some meaningful conversations. We all are hearing the sound bites of people who are already saying, I'll never forgive them, never forgive. And I'm sure the Russian narrative, which we're hearing much less of, but some of us have insights into that, will be similar, a great resistance to reconciliation. Any thoughts about steps towards that?
Yeah. So, let's hope that we do not end up in a nuclear war and that we are all around to see the end of this war. And yes, there's the book, Every War Must End. And so looking towards when this war ends, there will be so much work to do, so much work to do. Assuming that there are Ukrainian people and Russian people surviving after all this, that there will be, some pragmatic things like helping people find out what happened to their loved ones that died in the war. There will be pragmatic things about finding missing persons who disappeared during the war. So that sort of contact will be necessary to rebuild after this war. And then there will be so much needed to rebuild just basic lives in the places that have seen such destruction. And with that, there may be some reason for contact, across this huge division. I think that, within Ukraine, there will be reasons for, lots of intra-Ukrainian conversations about, what is the future of Ukraine after this, devastation, and what direction does the rebuilding take? And I think it's really for the people most directly involved to figure out what conversations they're ready for when. I don't anticipate having someone say, can you invite us to the United States, and me saying, oh, sure, come on, come meet with this other group right now, because the war is still going on. I don't think that anyone would say yes to that. But I do think what, I see lots of other peacemakers on this call, some who have some connections to Ukrainians, and I think that what we can do is be listening for what help do they want from outside. Do they want to, have some external convener convene something? Do they want someone to give them ideas about what happened in other post-war situations, so they can compare and contrast and consider what they want to do? So I think it's really, be ready to listen to what Ukrainians want after this, and be ready to see the diversity of people in all countries that, I see here in the United States, a vilification of kind of all Russians, as opposed to vilifying this horrible war, and the military and the attacks that Putin has ordered. And I know that there are some Russians who are anti-war, and so to keep that in mind too, I think will be painful, because it's so much easier to see things as all black and white. But long term, we're going to have to see the complexity here, and recognize that there also were, Russians speaking out against the war, Russians getting thrown into prison because they spoke out against the war, or did something simple as carrying white roses as they walked down the street, and that was seen as a sign of protest. So yeah, it's this complex situation, and there's going to be unfortunately a lot of work for those people doing peace work. Yeah, this is the sort of thing that sure would have been a lot easier to figure out in a few months ago. Yeah.
Right. Before
the
killing.
Yeah.
We're all familiar with the very big difference between peacemaking before and after.
Yeah.
I would just like to throw into some shuttle diplomacy, but again, it would depend on what people want outsiders to do. So the next question, I have a couple of more, but this is a little more complex question. We're in the very details of the South Caucasus conflicts and the South Ossetia, Georgia, Abkhazia dynamics, but every time I hear Ukraine and Georgia spoken as if it's exactly the same, I would like you to see how you would address that. What are the differences, if there are any, from your point of view? What simple way can we think about what those differences are, and if they're even valid enough differences to talk about?
I think there's some similarities in all wars, just the horror of the atrocities and the, devastation and the deaths and the turmoil and the upheaval and the loss of life and the people fleeing and so forth. And whether that happens on, a smaller scale or a medium scale or a large scale, it's just all horrible. So there is that similarity, but in terms of like the structure of the conflicts and the dynamics, I think that the fighting in Georgia was limited time-wise, and that has allowed people to rebuild in a way that I think will take much longer in Ukraine. The devastation was horrible. Any family that lost a family member is grieving still to this day, and the trauma lives on. And yet it didn't go to the extent that we've seen in Ukraine. And so I see a difference in scale and a difference in time and a difference in, the devastation has been at a different scale and different size. So I think that's a difference. I think also there's a sense in the US, how it's been covered. What I saw in August of 2008 was that there wasn't even any awareness that there were people called South Ossetians, that they spoke an Ossetian language. It was just very, very seen as Georgia, Russia. Whereas here I see in this conflict, it's being covered in a way that acknowledges Ukraine as a multi-ethnic society, and that there have been Russian-speaking Ukrainians, and that they're a part of this conversation too. I think in Georgia, we saw the EUMM, the European Union did Heidi Teklovina did a report on, just let's understand what happened here. And we don't have that kind of thing for Ukraine yet, but the stories that we saw about, the beginnings of the fighting in August of 2008 in Georgia were that there were skirmishes and there were fighting going back and forth, and that there was significant military action from the Georgian side as part of that, and that in Ukraine we haven't seen such documentation, and we haven't seen it seemed like a very, very large scale Russian onslaught immediately as the first big shot there, even though there had been, of course, long simmering conflicts. It hadn't been the scale of violence. So this scale is really different, really different. Yeah. Oh, and I think you're muted, Paula.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Next question is about, the complaint often from donors, policymakers, dialogue for dialogue's sake, is just a waste of money and time. Your project has many concrete outcomes. I'd like to find out a little bit more about how everyone arrived at the idea that the dialogues were for the sake of taking action and not just the abstract action of reconciliation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that came from asking the people who gathered at that first meeting at Point of View here at George Mason in the fall of 2008, asking, what would be helpful to you? What would you like to talk about? And what they wanted to talk about was both a sharing of their experience, and then look at this humanitarian stuff. We got to deal with it. And then that led to some action. So Lara Olson on this call here, she was part of an effort to do some survey of the kind of humanitarian needs on both sides of the ceasefire line. And that involved people, on both sides doing some assessments of what was needed. And then people wanted to take action after seeing the results of that, and wanted to address the humanitarian needs. So I think listening to what people wanted, and they wanted action. They wanted to, deal with the problems.
Could you give us an example of one or two of those actions and the concrete results?
Yeah, so there is a dam up high in the North Caucasus Mountains with a huge reservoir. If you look at the map, it's just this huge amount of water held back by a dam. And the dam gates had broken. And so in some of our dialogues, a major concern was raised of, look, if we've got people going up, they're throwing grenades into the water to stun the fish so they can go home with a whole lot of fish. If one of those grenades hits this concrete wall, it could burst and a tsunami 3 meters high would be released. And that would reach to villages, both Georgian and South Ossetian inhabited villages downstream. And so that was something that was on the minds of everyone. It was at the official level talks. It was, villagers living in those villages were aware of this, and it was a big worry. And so the informal discussions became a place where, without the politicization of questions of recognition or questions of territorial integrity, just without all that, we talked with an engineer who had helped build the dam 50 years earlier. And he was able to describe particular ways of trying to fix it so that the water could be released and it wouldn't be overflowing. And through a series of informal discussions offline, away from the limelight of being in Geneva, we were away from Geneva, we were informal, we were a university studying the process of how can you fix this dam. Having some Georgian and South Ossetian people with some technical expertise talk together about how it could happen, ended up with, the OSCE was able to coordinate and fund a major repair project. And this particular Georgian engineer was able to travel to oversee some of the technical aspects. And the dam was repaired. I remember when that Georgian engineer he called me up on Skype one day and he had the biggest smile on his face. He said, "The water's flowing, it's flowing." And I was like, "Oh, yes." And then he explained, that means they did it. This thing we'd been discussing, 2 weeks earlier. And he'd been drawing pictures on a napkin of how to do it. And they lifted the gates. They had lifted the gates. And that meant that the water could be regulated and the danger of a potential tsunami was much less because much less water in behind the dam. Yeah. So did that get at I've forgotten what your initial question was, but I went off on my story.
Yeah. What kinds of, that's great. I know there were others that had more to do with missing in action or POWs, or rather prisoners of war, right? Exchange. So, but moving on, I see a couple of really good questions. And by the way, if you want to ask any follow-up questions to any of these, or you have your own questions, please put them in the chat and we'll hopefully get to all of them. I'm going to try to combine my last two questions, which is really about, we've been doing, those of us on this call, I think, have been more focused on local peace building, specific contexts. And I'm feeling an urgent need to think about, how we can become more global in our reach, that this war has really confronted, the idea that we can keep on doing little things here and there and make any big difference. This is almost a world war. Some will argue it. We already are in a world war. So what thoughts do you have about taking our work without leaving local work, but giving it more transnational aspects, or building a really strong peace movement that can in the future prevent this war? Something to stand up and confront the militarism that is so far the big discussion right now. How can we move from this to, what we've all been working for? And I'm going to combine it with young people, because I'm also interested in your thoughts about how we can mobilize what seems to be a strong anti-war movement globally among the youth. And certainly in Russia, we saw that even in those harsh conditions of repression.
Yeah, so there's a lot. It's going to take a lot, Paula, and you're quite right to focus on young people, because it's going to be a very long-term process. I think that, peace education work and transforming, building a culture of peace globally is a long-term process that we got to put more effort into. Yeah, and looking at the dollars we spend on military compared to the dollars we spend on building peace, it's just a huge, huge difference, and we got to shift that. And I also think, I get it that talking about, a dam that gets repaired through some cooperation just doesn't sound like a big deal. It's a small, small baby step. It leads to sharing irrigation water, and it leads to contacts that build confidence through sharing the irrigation water. And then I think that these small, small steps are important because of what they build long-term over time. And so I would say to see our work as incremental. And even when, I guess there's this story of, this phrase we have of 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And maybe we've just taken, 1,000,000 steps backward in terms of global peace and so forth, that it's just been this huge, huge, setback. But we still need to put one foot in front of the other, because otherwise, what have we got? Like, we have to keep working for peace. So yeah, I guess you're asking me to say, what do we need to do? And I think we need to do 1,000,000 different things that all add up, and they're going to be clustered around the peace education that you've emphasized. They're going to be clustered around, here, I was just talking with some students here at George Mason University yesterday saying, learn other languages. We need to be able to connect and speak with other people, learn other languages, reach for intercultural understanding, international relationship building, connect, in this connected world, be curious about others and build that. And I think that then we also need to build in the conflict resolution field. I'm seeing my colleague Mark Gopin here has just come out with a great book that we launched recently. I've got it here still on my desk, Compassionate Reasoning. And he argues for that our training in the conflict resolution field needs to really include some inner work so that we can engage compassionate reasoning effectively. And I think we need to look at the international structures. How long has it been that we've had the OSCE? Is it effective? What do we need to do to build effective international connections? The UN, how is it working? Like, we need to approach this huge problem from many, many perspectives. Yeah, and so I look at this call, I'm really heartened to see so many people coming in to talk about this today. I think that each of us have different roles to play. Each of us come from different perspectives with different, platforms and different places where we have connections and strengths, and we all have different roles to play. And if you look, any one individual of us, it might feel like, oh my goodness, what are we doing trying to do peace work in a world like this? But then look at all of us, and all of us together, we can make a difference. So that's what gives me hope, Paula, is all of you here.
Thank you, Susan. You've in bits and pieces answered some of the questions that I see here in the chat. I'm going to, but one you haven't brought up, and I'm going to go to some of the others too. So don't worry. I would like to speak them because I think there are some even answers in your questions. But this question came right away in the beginning of your talk. What about working in places where Americans are suspect? Especially in a region that has historical grievances against Americans, and certainly the regions we work in, Susan, have those, and probably every region does. So what's your experience being an American doing this work in places where people have these anti, but very pro-American too? I mean, you have a range, but how do you deal with people thinking you're a spy or
yeah, I guess, I think I shared with you many years ago when someone did accuse me of being a spy, and it just is not a part of the world I've connected with, and didn't have anything to say other than saying, well, no. And we've had, certainly there was a disinformation campaign of some news releases that came out about some of the Georgian South Ossetian work came from Russian sources saying that we were working on some American plot to do Georgian territorial integrity and so forth. So yeah, being an American comes with being an American. I carry, that citizenship and that, all the US news I read every day and so forth. I carry that with me. And I think that being very clear and honest with the parties when I'm engaging that, yes, I'm American. And yes, I can, go to DC area meetings where various DC area policy experts, are talking about these things. And I know what's happening in the DC, the Washington, discussions about these things. That can also be a strength, even though, if I don't try to pretend that I'm not steeped in what the conversations are in Washington, but that it's a strength that I, I can write in English and write funding proposals that help support some of this work, that I can reach out to policymakers on particular issues. And if I'm judicious about, not overstepping my invitation, people will, respond to me about particular questions that I need some advice on from people involved in the official level talks too. So there's some advantages to being who I am, and disadvantages because people from the Russian side may be suspicious. I remember I wanted to go to South Ossetia, and I asked, this was many years ago, and I asked, if my work were humanitarian, could I go in from the north? And so then I went to the Russian embassy and asked them, can I get a visa? And it needs to be multi-entry because I want to go through Vladikavkaz and then south into South Ossetia. And, we'll see if the Georgian government gives me permission to do this. But, first thing is I would need a visa first, and then I'd have my humanitarian work to do that would let me go in from the north. And the Russians said, oh, we'd be happy to get you a visa. Yes, yes, yes. And they gave me a visa to go to Moscow and have meetings at their at Mead there in Moscow. And it didn't include Vladikavkaz, and it wasn't multi-entry. So I couldn't get to South Ossetia, even with all the efforts. Plus, the Georgian government probably would not have allowed it anyway, unless I'd really been convincing about my humanitarian approach. So I don't remember why I got on that. Oh, that's about being an American. Yeah, so I've got an American passport, and that's how I travel.
Right. So many good questions coming in. I'm having a hard time choosing. But I think it is important to talk about what advice you have for young scholars and students who are interested in pursuing the work as a career path. And one of the other comments was about a lifelong commitment. So you mentioned language, and I'm just throwing in, when you do this work, you have to really be ready to do it for the long term. Any other advice to young scholars, maybe how to start, or not just scholars, but people interested in helping?
Yeah, I think that I think of working on conflicts. We have one of our former colleagues at George Mason, Mara Dugan, wrote a lovely article about a nested model of conflict. And in it, she had been asked to engage in a fight, in a conflict in a school where some teenagers had had a fight. And the school wanted her to focus on these particular teenagers. And she ended up engaging and asking questions and finding out that, it was teenagers connected in a community where there were these racial dynamics, where there was this history of racism and this, oppressive kind of, the Civil War in the US, and this was a southern state. And anyway, she ended up doing an intervention that engaged in all these levels. It wasn't just these particular teenagers, it was the whole systemic change. It was, international racism. It was the national, it was the space and the name of that school with its racist connotations and what a Confederate flag meant in that place. And so what I would say to people who want to get into doing conflict resolution, do it wherever you are. Neighbors who have a barking dog problem, help them out, and learning local mediation, and learning ways of doing, we've got so much division here in the US. I see we've got people from all over the world, but speaking to this place where I'm living here, we have such division here in the US, and there's so much need to bridge across differences here. I think getting involved in the work wherever you are and then building from that can be helpful. I didn't jump into doing work internationally. I was already engaged as a teenager in peer mediation. You know, that coming from that starting from your own community can build the kind of skills, and just listening is such an important part. And practice that wherever you are can prepare. So that would be advice for people who want to get into doing this work. And apply to George Mason University. We offer undergraduate, graduate certificate, master's, and PhD in conflict analysis and resolution. We have a lot of certificates that can be done in just 15 credits, kind of short term if you're coming from a different career and you want to switch in.
Great. Well, I'm going to read some advice that came from Evans. The discussion of, how to make our work more global. And there's a suggestion that in those places where the OSCE is active, especially where multinational OSCE missions are in the field, it's possible for qualified individuals to volunteer for service in these missions, which are usually composed of both civilians and, where appropriate, military officers. Typically, an OSCE mission will need specialists like lawyers, human rights experts, sometimes even specialists on religious issues. The State Department regularly suggests people for these roles. And by the way, although these jobs are not paid, the per diem is more than adequate. And usually there are budgetary funds to accomplish useful work. Thank you for that suggestion.
Yeah. Thank you, Ambassador Evans. And you would know from having led the OSCE mission in Moldova, working on Moldovan Transnistrian discussions.
Oh my gosh, many questions. Would anybody like to just speak and say something to all of us about your thoughts on how to make the work that we've been doing relevant to how those of us with some contacts and ability could help address what we know is a lot of work that needs to be done in our field during and after this conflict. Anybody want to raise their hand and jump in? Okay, I don't see that.
I see a question in the chat from Laura, who Laura, do you want to talk about your question? There you are.
Good morning, everyone. I'm so sorry my camera's off because it's get the teenager out to school time here in Calgary. Well, I just wanted to kind of bring the conversation maybe to some of the longer term impacts of this work in Georgia, South Ossetia that I think the book really nicely highlights, and that it's built these, what I've seen are really kind of unexpectedly strong relationships between individual Ossetian and Georgian peacemakers and activists, and that have, extend beyond any meeting or formal activity. And I've seen pop up in different ways because we're in a common network, and I can see these things. And even though these people may disagree very strongly still on what the cause of all this is and what the solutions might be, these networks have a life of their own. And I just wonder, Susan, if you wanted to maybe say a bit more about that in that context, what you've seen. I mean, that's the essence of conflict resolution and peace building, is building relationships and trust across divides. And I think that the work in Georgia, South Ossetia has done that in spades. And I don't know how you think about that as the one of the key results.
Yeah, I think you're right, Laura, that there's something remarkable with people who've built, friendships despite their very deep political differences, and relationships of trust, even though they disagree very much on political future and political status. That's been really, really important. And I think that ties into a comment John Murray has put in the chat. He writes that he's drawn to the references to long-term relationships and to it's all about people and their choices and this individual agency stuff. And and then the combination of considering that in the framework of there's also geopolitical power dynamics. And so the linkage between those. And so I think, Laura, the strong interpersonal trust and confidence that's been built over many, many years of meetings in person, and accomplishing a lot in terms of these small incremental steps that, address humanitarian issues, that ability to work together on shared humanitarian areas or shared confidence building initiatives has built this trust that means that in time of crisis, there's a deep connection there to draw on. And so, yeah, I mean, the connections of, when people see something in the news that is alarming or surprising, and they know someone they can call up and ask, hey, what's going on over there? What's for real here? Is this news real? I think that makes a difference. I don't know. Are you thinking of specific examples? This works so well. Are you thinking of specific examples of where that's made a difference?
Well, I mean, I just have seen, I suppose, it extends beyond just checking in for a reality check sometimes to really joint thinking and joint strategizing about how we can, how to move each society in different ways. And so there's a sort of a level of strategic joint thinking that has emerged, which I think because of the longevity of the process you've been leading, that's not necessarily a normal outcome for something that's more short term. So I think it speaks to the power of that. Now it's open-ended, as you acknowledge fully in your book and in your work, as to what gets produced by that. That's in the hands of those activists themselves. But I think that catalytic role that this very long-term engagement has produced is very powerful in my experience.
Thank you. Thank you. I think I often hope it is. And then I wonder, am I seeing too much into it? But yeah, I mean, if I were to do this, if we take process tracing and we look at, a discussion in between, people who have a trusting interpersonal relationship and are well placed to talk with the leadership on both sides. And there's a big discussion about why isn't the incident prevention response mechanism meeting, and what could replace it, and brainstorming about all the different ways that, some small incident could not escalate into a full-blown war again. That conversation ended with one of the people who participated in the Geneva talks saying, well, I'm going to go home and I think you'll see the IPRM start up again in 2 weeks. And sure enough, it did. And so it was that trusting kind of open relationship of looking at what else could happen besides an IPRM. What would a hotline look like, or what would this look like, or what else could there be? And we really did, we hammered that question for hours about, okay, if IPRM is not able to meet, what else could we do? And in the end, the discussion was, we really need to convince people to start the IPRM again, and they did. And I think you're right that like how the shared analysis of what's possible here led to a consideration of, well, okay, this is the one that's most possible, really.
We are at our end time, but I do want to say that we had so many great.
We go for another half hour if we
want
to.
Oh,
yeah,
I'm
we
sorry.
scheduled for an hour and a half. Yeah, but people can leave as they need to.
No, then that's wonderful. I was rushing through, thinking we were ending now. Pardon me, everybody. There is a question for Laura.
California time.
I know I did wake up, but there was a question for Laura in the chat about the evaluation. I'm not finding it now. Did you happen to see that, Laura?
There's a question about indicators. Yeah.
Right. I wonder if maybe that could be done offline. And I'm also wondering if some of the great comments that are here can be captured in, a chat. I haven't been copying anything from the chat, but it would be lovely.
Before I end the session, I'll try to figure out how to capture the chat. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Um,
Because there are many comments.
Yeah, and so people, if people want to talk too, we've been doing kind of this, Paula and I doing most of the talking, but I see Ola, you've posted around around networks.
Yes, that would be interesting to hear more. Um,
And let's
Is-
also find the evaluation comment was a few chats back.
Okay, so let me go with the most recent one. So networks, re-networks, they are still rather small groups. And to Susan, do you have any advice on strategies, how to increase the outreach and go beyond those groups? Maybe it's happening anyway through family, neighborhood, et cetera, relations. Very important question. And the ripple effect, kind of. Yeah.
Yeah, so I recall, Paula, you and I were part of a meeting of Georgians and Abkhaz many years ago, who were a core group that had met together multiple times and had built this ability to speak openly. And I saw Jay Rothman was on here. Jay had encouraged us to do an action evaluation process with this group. And so we had gone through questions of what are we trying to do and why are we trying to do it and how can we do it? And that led to this group coming up with this really strong statement: we have to expand the network. We have to gradually increase who can engage in these kinds of very open, honest conversations. Who's not many people are even interested in it, and people might come with very strong kind of blinders on and inability to listen. And I think that group did gradually expand. And so from that lesson, Ole, I would say expanding gradually. And it may just be a couple new people each time, so that there is a core group that can support the openness of conversation, the willingness to set aside deep political differences and engage constructively on some specific issues. Yeah, but that's a skill that people learn over time, and I think it's easier to learn it when you're around others. I also think working with young people is a great idea, especially in contexts where communities have been so divided that a whole generation is growing up separated. That having contact amongst young people is going to be important. And Ole, you're talking about like the family neighborhood relations. I do think that happens. I think that people who are engaging across the divide are talking with their family and their neighbors as they are safe to do so. I think there is some concerns about being too open about cross-conflict engagement in some contexts. And Nika, your comment here, Alana, who's on the call here, and Nika Karstarfin, Alana Shapiro, Nika Karstarfin, did a report on increasing the reach beyond the dialogue group. Nice, thank you for that link. The meta evaluation. Learning from other contexts, what has worked there? Thank you, Nika. Do you want to say anything about that, Nika or Alana?
No, I think it's all in the report. We were trying to answer that question about, because dialogue groups tend to be very small. How do we, do things transfer out just organically, or is there something that makes it more successful to increase that reach beyond the group? And that was basically what the question that we were asked to do research on, using all of the grants that USIP has issued that use dialogue as a process. So we looked at over 100 projects and did some field research, et cetera, but it's all there in the report.
And the answers, can you give us a high level summary of like key answers?
I mean, Alana can jump in on this, but my big takeaway was that it needs to be intentional, that the assumption that things are just going to naturally, organically ripple out is not necessarily accurate, depending on the people involved. But that the projects that seemed to have the most, when we called it transfer, were those that built in either at the beginning or somewhere during the process or at the end of the process, some way of taking the learning from within the group outwards. And that might have been, developing some action-oriented projects or connecting with, political folks or something, but the ones that seem to have the most reach and the most impact were the ones that were the most intentional about that. So thanks.
I'd like
Thank
to
you.
say something about that. I agree completely. And, when we started out the APA's Georgian work, and Susan came in at the point after we had done Susan and Jay, after we had spent 2 years with shuttle diplomacy because one side absolutely refused to meet in person with the other side. But when they finally were willing to do that, we intentionally worked on, like Susan said, they wanted to expand the circle. But I am here to say that was next to impossible. There's so much fear in the community on one side, the APA side. There were so many, the grudges, the inability to step out of the pain that people were in, and some vested interests made that, even though we were intentional, what I learned from that is once a little bit of blood is shed, comparatively, it becomes next to impossible to have any kind of loud voice for peace in a community. And even today, the APAs have put out a very sensitive statement about their concern for the current situation. And I'm using these terms because that's how they were speaking. And they got so much flack for that in their own community. Oh, don't, upset the Russians. Why couldn't you have just not said anything? And so I'd like to have Susan say a little bit about the program that you're working on. And then I'd like to go back to something Mark has written in the chat. But the program on, the studies on better evidence and prevention.
Yeah. So, and we've got a project at George Mason called Better Evidence Project, where we're trying to bring as much open access materials as possible into one place, so that people who are asking questions like, how do we increase the reach beyond the dialogue group, what kind of transfer is possible, can go and find Alana and Nika's good report, for example, would be something to put there. And the USIP materials are ones that we do have permission to work with. But so to try and make as much possible open access in kind of a one-stop shop that people can come and find evidence that's either based on something like the meta evaluation that Alana and Nika did, or something based on a practitioner's experience in one particular context where they share in-depth experience. So that's exciting I can put in the chat here, or Ziad, if you could put in the chat the Better Evidence Project webpage, just to let people know more about it. We'll be circulating soon. The research center will have a lot more material in it in the coming months. It's kind of something we've just now started up.
Excellent, because that can help people who have just local knowledge, but can find out from other people where they have been more successful. So intention is great, but knowledge is a very good helper in this. Mark
let me just add one. Can I say one more thing on that topic, though, of the transfer? Is that there's a kind of transfer that, and this gets at kind of something I talk about in my chapter 1 of, this is this invisible, quiet thing that happens, but there are times when official negotiators meet in unofficial contexts. And they do this as part of like, okay, we can go to this university convened informal discussion. This is not official negotiations. This is just brainstorming, or this is just looking at, other conflicts and getting ideas from other perspectives. And it complements the official process. And we call that track 1.5 diplomacy. It's the track 1 people, but they're in an unofficial track 2 format. And the transfer is so direct. I mean, their experiences from the work that Norwegian Refugee Council and Conflict Management Group did that Laura was part of in the 90s, where, an exercise in an unofficial discussion on, gee, what would be useful for someone from my side to say publicly that would resonate well with your side. And people went home and one of them gave that speech that they'd kind of, brainstorm together what would be key points to include. And so there's really can be direct transfer outside of the dialogue group into, a public speech that's given by an official, was in that particular example. And I think so the deliberate thinking about transfer can also include transfer to the official level negotiations where there can be an immediate difference.
Thank you, Susan. I'd like to read what Mark has said because I'd like us to also think about this, and anyone can chime in, starting with Susan, though. We do have to have humility before tsunamis of a military, superpower, or even actual tsunami nature wipes out all the work. I agree with Susan that we have vastly underestimated the power of our collective work and care. Even as we do very different things, we need much more inclusive models of social, economic, military, political, and psychosocial, cultural, and religious positive change so that we can more easily regroup after tsunamis. And I think evidence suggests durability with collective embrace. Mark, do you want to say any more on that? Or?
No, I already said too much in that long quote. But I just, this is why I support Susan's work so much, because I think at the core of it is collaboration and relationships, and long-term relationships build very surprising things that no one could have imagined in the future. And I've been in Syria for 18 years. I never would have believed that we would be helping thousands of women now. We just didn't start out that way, but it was all relationships, one after the other. So relational peace building is, I think, at the core of overcoming extremely bad structures of violence.
Hopeful. Thank you. Other questions, many that I haven't asked.
Well, if I could just jump in, maybe just to provoke more discussion around, what are the longer term impacts of this type of work, and I guess what I've seen as well in terms of beyond the power of relationships, it's really about an education process in a way that I think you're exposing people to through through engagement, through exchange. And then I see, because Susan and I are in similar professional networks, I see the things that people do in their own time, in their own social media posts, in their own engagement with their own, country people and countrymen and women, and that arguments that they put forward are clearly very influenced by that process of engagement, like they would be by any education process that they've gone through. So, I mean, it's very intangible and hard to quantify, and it's certainly hard to claim that this is a direct product. You're helping, essentially form people's worldviews, and you're creating a space where the worldview includes some of the worldview that exists on the other side. And then I see the power of that in people's own independent activity. And I think, in the evaluation world around peace building, we're, I think, more and more coalescing around a notion of contribution versus direct attribution for anything. These very complex kinds of processes. And I think that this element gets very underestimated. Even though we acknowledge the formal role of educational experiences, peace education, whatever, higher education abroad, we don't often acknowledge dialogue and engagement as itself an education space. So throwing that out there.
I'm sorry.
No, I guess it was more than just a comment. I guess I was hoping to hear some thoughts from Susan on that as the sort of convener of that space over the years. What you make of
that the dialogue can be an educational space.
Yeah. And what you've seen emerging from that.
Yeah, I have seen individuals who are new to the dialogue process learn so much from their first experience of an informal dialogue. There was someone who came from the official negotiations and had never been in an informal environment. And I made the mistake of not fully briefing this person before the dialogue about, kind of the differences between the discussion, the tone of discussions and the goals and the so forth. And there was a very, difficult opening of, we go around and we introduce ourselves, and the early introduction included a very pointed comments that really offended the people from the other side. And these were things that might have been appropriate in an international format where there's a big audience, where you want to kind of score points about CC, I'm really supporting my side. But they were very, very offensive to the people from the other side. And over break, they told this person about that look, that's something you say to the press. That's something you say, but you don't need to say that to us, because we're here to actually solve some problems together. And it was a transformation. By the end of that, there were people sitting around in the evening talking about their families, and actually doing some serious brainstorming about ways to address some of the serious issues. So that was an education. That particular dialogue process was a huge education for someone who, still has very strong connections to the leadership on that side of the conflict. And I think that kind of key education was useful. And I'm sorry it started with the rude first words, but it turned into people embraced the chance to kind of create a new tone over the course of days.
Yes, and that says a lot about the space that you created for that kind of interaction. Any new
Well, that we all
projects?
did, and it also gets back to Lara's point about the deep relationships, that there were strong relationships there that were willing to say, hey, this is not the way we want to have a conversation for the next 3 days. Let's go have a chat over tea and coffee about it. Yeah. So I see Mark's got a hand raised.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I just wanted to ask Susan, what do you think the implications are of collaboration successes, relationship successes over time that are not being appreciated because of the way we evaluate things? And are there new forms of evaluation that would trace the algorithms of social networks and relationships achieved among and between enemies, different kinds of enemies? I mean, is there some better way that we can just say, well, we know that in the long term, this is wonderful, but we can't really prove it? I'm at this point dissatisfied with the field that can't really make this hard, so that we start to realize, yeah, these relationships are the core, and we can trace it, we can prove it. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And my, my go-to method of figuring out hard problems is to turn to friends and colleagues who have other strengths than I do. And I'm looking at Ilana and Mika, who've done a lot of evaluation, and Lara, and others who are probably on screen too. I can't see Tats is here. Yeah, so I think Juliet, yeah, so others, Giselle, yeah, whoever else on this call wants to chime in with kind of innovative evaluation approaches. I would say the work, Mark, that we did when Lara was working with the Georgian Ossetian process on a 2-year deeper evaluation, that to me was very helpful at helping us build kind of a reflective practice in the whole team. And that reflective practice approach allowed us to appreciate shifts, appreciate nuances, appreciate trend. The image that came to mind is you plop a pebble in the water and these ripple effects. That to me, that was very powerful. Tats, I think you're in on this conversation on this top point.
May I? Hi, Susan. So I've been thinking about Mark's question now for a long time. And when I just finished my PhD at George Mason, I didn't think this way. But now this is my 25th year of doing peace building work. And then I have come to feel, which I haven't formalized theoretically, that one of the biggest impacts that I and others can create is to help raise people with a lifelong commitment to staying engaged. Rain or shine, resolution or resolution, how many people did I support to come from that context? And there may be war, there may be peace, there may be conflict. It doesn't matter. It's like the parents raising children. I think there's no end, there's no beginning. And they can point to their land and say, this is my graveyard. I will die trying this. And how many people have I identified, helped them, become even more aware of their commitment? This kind of thinking I didn't have when I was about to finish my PhD dissertation. I was thinking of policy, system change, and so on and so forth. But I began to realize as I enter my third decade, those things come and go. So it's the people, and that's my thinking now. And it may not actually be good for funders, but if that is what it is, then I think I should speak about it that way and have as much validity and legitimacy as possible to that, and theory should gravitate around it. That's one of the reasons why I think, Susan, your work is incredibly inspiring to me, because you have stuck with it for such a long time, rain or shine.
Thank you, Tats.
Absolutely. And it seems to me that the people here who have done that kind of work, and Susan, those of us who want to somehow be relevant to some post-war reconciliation in Ukraine, can think of working with people who have made these long-term commitments in each of the places we've been working, and multiplying our efforts. I see something.
I want to highlight Nika. Nika, you snuck into the chat message here. Some serious evaluation approaches everyone should be aware of, and that's the most significant change approach, the outcome harvesting approach, and process tracing approaches that can be useful in getting at, Mark, your kind of the more difficult shifts, how to get at those.
What new project are you working on, Susan? Do you have another book in mind?
All right. Yeah, we are getting towards the wrap-up period. I don't have another book in mind, but I have in mind evidence to action. I want to really build the connections of multiple practitioners sharing their experience and their insights with each other, and sharing those with others who are doing peace work, who then feed back in their experiences. So I really want to work on the kind of open access and focused commitment to sharing what we learn from our experience with others, and learning more from new experience and others' experience, and having this sharing. I feel like this gets at the problem of, so what are we going to do in this field, and are we going to be able to make a difference when there are these huge, what Mark called tsunamis, these huge, just horrific major wars. What can we do in the face of that? And I think we got to really work together. We really got to build this field's work together. And the long-term work, Tats, I agree with you. The long-term piece is important, even though that might not be what the funders want. And I also think that there was a comment, Mark, you wrote in the chat here about the difference. Someone wrote about the difference between 30 years work and 2 years commitment. I'm not finding that. There's so many chat messages. I'm going to have fun reading these once we're finished here. But the difference between making a commitment for 2 years and making the commitment for 30 years is huge. That's huge. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, and Alana, you've got something here on evaluating impacts. Do we get to hear your voice before we conclude?
I think just my text voice is fine.
Okay, she says,
Sorry.
in terms of evaluating impacts of peace-building relationships, I really think we need longer term evaluations, processes that give us more than a snapshot, yes, but also provide an understanding of the dynamic expansion and successes of networks relationships. Yeah, well, thank you. I want to say before this all ends, Paula, if I can just say thank you to so many of you on this call who were part of making this book possible. Yeah, I see. Yeah, so many of you have been part of the work. Natia helped with the final copy editing piece. Thank you. Julie Mindy helped me with figuring out what to do about a map. And I'm just looking on the call, so many friends who've been part of this work over the years. Lara and Paula being part of the point of view Georgian Ossetian meeting when we met in 2008. So I want to just thank you all for making this possible. This is just doesn't feel right that it's just my name on the front, because this really was a collective effort to build all of the practice that fed into this, and lots of conversations with so many of you that are out there. And I also want to point out what the cover of the book has is all these dots connected by lines. And I didn't get a lot of choices from the publisher about what we'd put on the cover, but there were some kind of stock images and some differences in color. And I went for of the choices they gave me, this gave me a sense of like this vast ocean of like power. You know how powerful the ocean is? Like we're talking about tsunamis, like the ocean can be really, really powerful. So I got the blue part that made me think of the ocean. And then like each peacemaker is connected to others, and we create this web of possibility. So we've got the people-centered approach with, each person matters, and then together people make a big difference. So that's my trying to have a little hope on the cover of a book. And Paula, thank you for leading us through this discussion and doing the hard work of very active chat and so many people with so many great comments. Thank you all for coming today.
It was great to see everybody, and thank you for your comments. And I do hope we can record them, because normally I'm sitting in the webinar doing that myself, but I couldn't this time. And I hope we get to resume again soon. Those of us who are interested in maybe taking our local knowledge and put it into more of a transnational space at this moment would be, I think, my next steps, what I want to do. And thank you for doing the hard work of writing that book, so we could all know more about everything. Is there anything else you want to say, a question you didn't get asked that you'd like to address?
No, I just wish you all,
Okay.
I wish you all peace. Go, yeah.
Let's just
Take a
be
deep
kind
breath
to
and-
everybody in our lives. That's all we can do as individuals at this point.
So good to see so many of you. I want to have like a reunion chat too.